8 months ago, I made a video explaining the major design problems of Star Rail's damage over time archetype, which I assumed were the reasons that the team hadn't received any new characters since Black Swan released in 2.0. Well, after many more months, finally in 3.5 we've just gotten Hysilens, the third ever limited 5-star DoT character, and she's proven me wrong in some ways, but also proven me right in others. Let's talk about the challenges Hoyo was forced to take on when designing a character who has the full responsibility of reviving an entire archetype from the dead, and whether we should expect more DoT units or be prepared for it to be ignored for another year and a half. If you haven't watched my previous video, I recommend it because in it I give a lot of context about the entire history of the DoT archetype and why Kafka and Black Swan have been the only usable units up until now, but the main point boiled down to simply adding another character that had a DoT effect wouldn't have helped the team, as we saw with Zhao Cho. Black Swan would only slightly get faster stack generation on her unique Arcana DoT, and Kafka's detonation would only get meaningful increases in DPS output if said new ally had exceptionally strong personal DoT damage, since it scales off the strength of the original effect. The situation was shaken up a bit, however, when Kafka was announced to be getting direct buffs. After they dropped in 3.4, they did something pretty unexpected by turning her originally DPS-oriented kit into more of a hybrid support. Firstly, she got some much needed quality of life, with her skill's detonation now applying to all 3 targets rather than just the one, her follow-up being expanded to trigger off all ally attacks and not just basics, and she also got a second charge for it. But then they rounded her out by giving her a new second ascension passive that increases the attack of all allies with high effect hit rate stats, which is especially relevant for the scaling of DoT users. And lastly, they added a new 6th Ascension passive that lets her also detonate DoTs with her follow-up attack. Although the changes certainly made Kafka stronger while still committing to the original design of a DoT detonation focused character, it didn't do much to address the fundamental problems that the archetype faced. That's why Hysilens had a really big responsibility to have mechanics which could fix or compensate for these issues, because if she didn't, there wouldn't be a whole lot of reason to run DoT over other teams that are more flexible in units while also being easier to use. The devs certainly had this in mind when creating her ultimate, which is really the crux of why she works as a unit. Firstly, it deploys a zone that reduces the attack of enemies by 15% and their defense by 25% with upfront AoE damage, but the real important part is that for every instance of DoT taken by an enemy inside, Hysilens deals her own physical DoT damage to them up to 8 times. The effect lasts for 3 turns, has a fairly standard energy cost of 110, and despite it being an ultimate, you don't have to worry about a lack of uptime at the start of battle thanks to her second ascension trace. The way this ability functions addresses the number one problem that came with buffing DoT as a team. Originally, DoT felt like the kind of archetype where the more DoT effects you had available across your 4 party members, the stronger the overall output would be. Kafka definitely created that kind of environment in early version 1 by outputting more damage per skill with more DoT allies, but that was pretty much lost when generalist supports began to contribute more to the team's damage than additional DoTs did. Not to mention, the follow-up team got fleshed out in version 2 and essentially stole that identity by each character contributing to chains of follow-up attacks triggering each other. Hysilens' ultimate actually does benefit massively from not only any DoT effect regardless of its strength, but also any DoT activation regardless of its strength. For Kafka's skill and follow-up, this means it gets Hysilens' full damage proc despite it only doing a portion of the DoT's original damage, as opposed to her ultimate, which post-buff does significantly more. But in the context of future characters, this effect also creates a niche for units with weaker DoTs to be more useful. That could take the form of a 4-star, or a character that can apply a DoT effect without it being the complete focus of their kit. Similar to how Cypher is a powerful generalist true damage support, but gains bonus synergies thanks to her follow-up. The healer slot seems like the obvious one to fill in, and while it still would be rather difficult to be more useful than the utility that the current best sustains provide, any kind of DoT effect or detonation ability will be more competitive than before thanks to Hysilens' damage, while also freeing up those flexible characters to be used on another team. The ultimate is obviously the central point of Hysilens' design, but the rest of her abilities do a pretty good job at supporting it. Her talent lets her apply each of the 4 different types of DoTs when an ally attacks, and it doesn't matter that her scalings here are very weak compared to other characters, because it's the quantity that matters for her ultimate rather than the quality. Her technique accelerates this at the start of battle and every new wave by applying 2 of these effects to each enemy. The skill can increase the damage taken by all enemies by 20% for 3 turns in an AoE, helping out with DPS and her DoT application. Her 4th Ascension Trace allows the initial attack of her ultimate to detonate for 150% DoT damage, which is the new highest multiplier for DoTs in the entire game. Her 6th Ascension Trace gives her the expected alternate scaling with effect hit rate so that it doesn't feel so terrible to build, since you're guaranteeing your DoTs land while also boosting damage output. Passives like this will probably continue to be the standard for DoT users going forward, especially with Kafka's team-wide attack buff now also being a factor. Of course, a lot of Hysilens' usefulness in the current meta does come from her very high numbers and endgame buffs that specifically overtune DoTs, but her kit is well rounded while setting a clear foundation for DoT to have more options in the future. That said, it's very apparent that there's a stark difference in how she performs with and without Kafka. Thanks to the buffs from last patch, Kafka's high detonation frequency is just so valuable for getting damage out of Hysilens, and the devs were certainly aware of that, as they even gave Hysilens extra skill point generation on her ults. Hysilens gets very little value out of her own skill when her DoTs are fully stacked because her debuff lasts for so long, so it's very much for the team. It really feels like Kafka is meant to be the face of DoT forever, which isn't too surprising considering she was the one to establish it originally while also being a very popular character, and it's not like this is the first time 2 units together are significantly stronger than individually. However, this leaves Black Swan in a pretty weird spot. Triple DoT is certainly a viable option, as there are synergies between all these units, and they even have it as Hysilens' trial team, but saying she's outdated is honestly just a fact at this point, considering she now has the oldest kit out of the 3, and it certainly shows with the finer details of her kit. Like for example, Black Swan's ult applies Epiphany, which causes enemies to take 25% more damage, but only during that enemy's turn. Clearly this is targeted towards only buffing DoT's backloaded damage, which is understandable, but that just means DoT detonation, and now Hysilens' ultimate procs on detonation don't benefit from this. The effect really should just specify a DoT damage increase, because it's not like you're going to run counterattackers on your DoT team. Hysilens being able to apply 4 unique DoTs does help Black Swan stack her unique Arcana DoT damage, but not as much as you'd think. It does directly contribute to Black Swan's passive, which stacks after enemies take any kind of DoT damage on their turn, and that's a pretty good synergy, but for every other method, there's actually not that much of a change. Black Swan's basic attack and skill generate additional stacks for each of the 4 DoT effects on an enemy, but the thing is that Epiphany already counts as every DoT for that reason. So while Hysilens certainly makes the stacking from this more consistent, because it only comes into play during Black Swan's ult downtime, the damage ceiling isn't really increased in the way you'd expect. It's even worse for Black Swan's other Ascension Trace, which stacks Arcana when DoTs are detonated, but is hard capped at 3 stacks per action. So even though Kafka is detonating a ton of DoTs at once, Arcana still has a very difficult time getting to its upper limit of 50 stacks. And because Black Swan only has her Arcana DoT without any detonations in her kit, she isn't exactly an enabler for Hysilens like Kafka is. Again, triple DoT is a good team, especially when it's giga buffed by the current endgame modifiers, but I find it a little disappointing that Black Swan still isn't able to reach her maximum damage potential due to her outdated design, since it feels like that would have really cemented the archetype's unique position of being all about having multiple damage dealers rather than damage buffing supports. Her getting a buff similar to Kafka is a possibility, but it just seems unlikely to happen anytime soon. DoT is really cool when it deals an overabundance of damage because you get to hit enemies on your turns and theirs, but when that isn't the case, it feels really bad to play, as we've experienced pretty much up until Hysilens' release. Part of the damage relies on waiting for the enemies to act, and applying all the individual DoT debuffs takes some time to ramp up, which are annoying things to deal with, but can be accepted as the major trade-offs for the archetype. However, for the other issues, like DoTs doing no toughness damage and debuffs being able to be removed by enemies, they are pretty big disadvantages that feel like they don't necessarily need to exist. These are what I'd consider the problems that Hysilens didn't manage to fix. though while she didn't directly address them with her kit, and DoT is just able to DPS check their way through them at the moment, I actually feel more confident now that these flaws could be addressed with new characters eventually, because Hysilens does create a better environment for DoT users that can prioritize utility over having tons of personal damage. I mean, I would sure hope it's not another year until the next character since the conditions are better now, but we'll just have to wait and see. I hope you found this video to be interesting or insightful. Subscribe for more Star Rail discussion videos, and as always, thanks for watching.